Well, Katharine, welcome to this conversation, and thank you for being part of this conversation on The Future is Calling Us to Greatness.
Thank you for having me.
So one of the questions that I've been asking, actually the first question I've been asking all of my guests, is to simply introduce yourself to the audience. I'm assuming, even though you're now a rock star in this sort of field, I'm assuming not everyone will know who you are and sort of how you got to where you are. So if you would share both a little bit of your trajectory in terms of your story, but also what are you best known for in the world?
Sure. I'm a climate scientist, which means that I study how the world around us affects us, especially kind of at the local scale where we live. We often don't realize how we depend on our climate for the water we drink or that we use to water our lawn or our crops, the food that we grow, the air that we breathe, the energy that we consume. And today, because of that energy, we're actually changing our climate. Every time we burn coal or gas or oil, it releases this invisible but very powerful gas into the atmosphere, carbon dioxide, that acts like an extra blanket that we're wrapping around our planet, trapping heat inside that would otherwise escape to space. That heat is changing our climate. It's altering the risk of extremes like heat waves and floods and very strong hurricanes. It's causing our sea level to rise. It's changing the amount of water we have. All of these things are things that impact us personally in the places where we live. And I would add, as a Christian, it's even more important because they specifically impact the people who are already living at the edge, whether it's here in North America or on the other side of the world. So the people who have the least resources to adapt to this changing climate are the very people who are being most harmed by it.
Yeah, exactly. Well, say a little bit more about how you became an atmospheric scientist. I know your dad was an inspiration to you, so share a little bit of your story in terms of how you came into science, and also, if you feel comfortable, sharing your own faith journey as well, because I'll probably share a little bit of that also, since we have some of that in common.
Yeah. I grew up in a Christian home where my dad was a science educator, originally a science teacher and then the coordinator for the Board of Education and now professor of education. So to me, science was, first of all, the most exciting thing in the world when you're, 3 or 4 years old. And second of all, it was a way to understand what God was thinking when he set up this amazing universe that we live in. So science just came very naturally, and it wasn't until I was halfway through my undergraduate degree that I actually realized that science is very hard and not always that fun. But by then it was a little too late. So I finished out my degree, and then I looked around to see what would be a way that I could make a difference. When you're at that age in your early 20s, you're like, I want my life to matter. How can my life matter? And at the time, I was actually studying astrophysics, which I loved, which is one of the most fascinating fields in the world, how we can tell things not just about our galaxy, not just about other distant galaxies, but even about the beginning of the universe, just from the observations that we can make here on our own planet. Mm-hmm. So astrophysics was amazing, but in third year university, I took a breadth requirement in the geography department on climate change. And I had known about climate change growing up in Canada. That's part of our high school curriculum. I knew it was real, but I kind of mentally classed it. We have like air pollution, water pollution, deforestation, loss of biodiversity, environmental green issues. It wasn't until I took that class that I realized that climate change is really huge, that it's affecting all of these other issues, that the reason why I care about climate change isn't because it's on this list of green things to care about. It's because climate change is affecting our lives, our health, our resources, our water, our economy. I mean, you name it. Right. And then I also realized that in studying physics and astronomy, I'd actually accidentally developed all the skills you need to do climate science and climate modeling. So from there, I began a career in climate science, knowing that I wanted to go in to an area where I could do science that would be used. So not just science that would be published in an academic journal or maybe published in a book, but science that can actually be used to make decisions, because we are being impacted today by climate change. And even though the future is uncertain, we know one thing for sure. And that one thing is that if we fail to account for how climate is changing when we're making our future plans, we're going to get the wrong answer.
Yeah, exactly. One of the things that when I was looking at your background, you've done research and have written on methane and the challenges that presents. And I know just recently in the news we've seen these craters in Siberia and that sort of thing. And some of the people sort of on the really far end of the doom and gloom that basically we're just all screwed, and that sort of thing, really point to some of the scary stuff around the melting of the permafrost and the methane release. Anything that you can share with us about both what you understand in terms of the science, what's happening there, and what actions we can take or what we can do to help avoid the worst catastrophes that are possible in terms of some of these runaway positive feedback loops.
Yes. Well, we scientists are a very, very staid and conservative bunch. I mean, about the worst thing you could possibly call a scientist is an alarmist.
Yes.
Scientists are always, in fact, studies have actually shown that, at least in the area of climate science, over the last 20 years, we have systematically underestimated the magnitude of climate change to the extent where they've actually coined a syndrome, erring on the side of least drama. That scientists hate drama, and we are subconsciously kind of downgrading our estimates of how bad things are because we don't want to be dramatic about it.
Right, of course.
So all this is the background to say that nowadays in scientific circles, when you see a worried scientist, that worries me more than if I saw a worried environmentalist.
Yes, exactly.
Environmentalists sometimes make a career out of being worried. Scientists, not so much. So when you see worried scientists, that's a sign that, we got to be sitting up and paying attention to this. And in science, one of the things that we is trying to understand how the planet is going to react to this experiment that we are conducting with the only planet we have. Mm-hmm. We have never in the history of the planet, as a human race, dug up so much coal and natural gas and oil and burned it and spewed all that carbon into the atmosphere so quickly.
Yeah.
So we don't know how sensitive the planet is to what we're doing. It's never happened before. It's like you invented a drug and you immediately give everybody on the planet this drug and you have no idea what the side effects of this drug are.
Yeah.
In fact, you didn't even know there were any side effects when you started taking the drug. So one of the biggest side effects that we're worried about is the fact that we know that up in the Arctic, in the ground and also in the continental shelf just under the ocean, there are enormous reservoirs of methane stored there. Now, methane is a really important heat-trapping gas. If that methane gets released to the atmosphere, 1 particle of methane is equal to 25 particles of carbon dioxide. So it's really, really powerful. What we're seeing is, we've seen for a long time now, is that as the land, the permafrost, is melting up in the Arctic, the methane that was trapped in that permafrost is being released into the air. What we're starting to see now, that we didn't even think was going to happen a couple of years ago, is that the methane in the continental shelves is also starting to be released as the ocean water melts. And we're starting to see these explosive releases, like these craters they're discovering in Siberia that you mentioned, that we're not sure yet, because it's still early days, but they are indicative of basically huge methane buildup underground and then an eruption. Yeah. Because methane is natural gas. That's what it is.
Exactly.
So these are the things that keep us scientists up at night. Now, there's no magic threshold of, if we burn so much fossil fuels, then we're okay, but if we burn just a little bit more, then we're screwed. It's kind of like there's no magic number of cigarettes you can smoke. Right. If I smoke this many cigarettes in my life, I won't get lung cancer, but if I smoke 1 more, I will, right. That doesn't. Right. But the one thing we know for sure is that the further down this pathway we go, the more cigarettes we smoke, the more carbon dioxide we produce, right. The higher the risk right. of these type of catastrophic events happening. So that's why I and other scientists feel that it's so important to reduce the amount of carbon we're producing. Yeah. And we can do it through a couple of different ways. We can do it by, number one, just being more efficient mm-hmm. with the way that we use our energy, which saves us money as well as reducing our carbon emissions. We can do it by switching from more intensive carbon-based fuels to less intensive. So right. switching from coal to natural gas helps. But long-term, the way we have to do it is we have to switch from using these old and dirty ways of getting energy to using clean, new ways of getting energy, like wind and sun and tides that are never going to run out on us.
Yeah, yeah.
And so this is what we have to do as a society long term.
Yeah. Well, I completely agree. In fact, I was just doing a presentation on the same title of this interview series called "The Future is Calling Us to Greatness" at a Catholic spirituality center just 3 nights ago. And one of the things that I talked about in there, and I actually have a quote from Bob Inglis, who's one of my heroes, a Republican from South Carolina. And, along with Citizens Climate Lobby and others that are advocating for a systemic solution rather than a government solution. But I love Bob Inglis says it just in the most concise way I've ever heard anybody say it. He says, I favor a conservative approach. This is his words. I favor a conservative approach that marshals the power of the market and doesn't increase the size of government. Here it is in a nutshell. Put all the costs in all the fuels and eliminate all the subsidies, and then watch the free market enterprise system solve the climate and energy crisis. And I just find that that's just a brilliant way of, that whole notion that we have to integrate true cost, because people think of coal as inexpensive. Coal is really expensive when you actually look at what the impacts are in terms of our health and the environment and future generations. That whole sense of intergenerational justice. And so you were speaking before about how, and this is one of the things I know you've used in your appeals to Christians, especially evangelicals, this sense of compassion for the poor and the outcast and the disenfranchised and those on the margins. And we need to also, as I know you agree, consider and hold in our heart our responsibility, our a commitment to a healthy future, and the fact that by simply status quo, doing nothing, or thinking that we can continue and just make small tweaks, changing light bulbs and flying less and driving less and that sort of thing, which is all good, but that's going to somehow magically create a world where our grandchildren aren't suffering a literal hell on earth. And so I know a policy recommendation isn't something that that you or most climate scientists have any interest in, but I'm wondering if you could say anything at all about sort of some of the systemic shifts, such as what Bob Inglis talks about, and do you see hope of that happening in the next? Because one of the things I said the other night is that if that happens in the next 2 or 3 years, or if that happens 10 years from now, at some point it'll happen. At some point we'll put a fair price on carbon pollution, and we'll marshal the power of the global market to help us move in the right direction. But whether we wait 10 years to do that or do it in the next 2 or 3 years, just that difference will make the difference between the suffering of billions of humans and animals for thousands of years. So anything that you'd be willing to share in terms of sort of the systemic stuff?
Absolutely. Well, that's why a large part of my research is devoted to quantifying the impacts that we expect. Because I feel like science can tell us that we have a problem. Climate is changing. Science can tell us why it's changing. This time, for the first time in history, it's not a natural cycle. It's not the sun. It's not volcanoes, it's humans.
Let me jump in, because I love the way you've done that. I've seen you do this on a video, and I think that you're brilliant in that. So could you pretend that you're talking to a skeptic, or how would you, somebody who says, it's just natural cycles, or it's just the sun. Share how we know scientifically that that's not the case.
Yeah. What I found is we really have to talk about this stuff because it makes sense to think it is a natural cycle.
Exactly.
And we can't just assume, trust me, it's not a natural cycle, let's move on. People deserve a real answer on that. They deserve to know that climate scientists have been studying natural cycles for more than a century, and that there's actually good facts and research to explain why we think it's humans. It's not that we've drunk the Al Gore Kool-Aid or something like that, as they often suspect. So what I try to do when I talk to people about climate change is I go through the reasons why we think climate has changed in the past. Natural cycles is number one on the list. And we have two kind of natural cycles, actually. We have ones that are inside our Earth system, and we have ones that are outside. So the natural system are like El Nino. When we have an El Nino, it gets wetter some places, it gets drier others, it gets warmer some places and cooler in others. So what natural cycles do inside our Earth system is they just move heat around. So they move it from east to west, they move it from north to south, they move it from the atmosphere into the ocean, or the ocean into the atmosphere. So if our planet were warming due to a natural cycle, and if that warming was seen in the atmospheric temperature, the air temperature, that heat would have to be coming from somewhere inside the Earth system. And the most likely candidate would be the ocean, since the ocean has a huge heat content compared to the air. So we look at the ocean, we say, has the ocean's heat content been going down while the atmosphere has been getting warmer? If the answer is yes, it's a natural cycle. The answer, though, is a resounding no, because the heat content of the ocean has actually increased 20 times more than that of the atmosphere and the land and ice all put together. So that's how we know it's not a natural cycle. The entire planet is warming from the depths of the ocean to the top of the troposphere. The other type of natural cycle we see causes the ice ages. And this one's really cool because it actually relates to astronomy. There's a Serbian engineer back in World War I who had a lot of free time on his hands at that time, and by hand calculated how shifts in the Earth's orbit around the sun actually cause the ice ages. So the natural question is, well, aren't we just recovering from the last ice age? The answer to that is, though, actually no, we are overdue for the next ice age. So the next thing on that calendar is not a warming. The next thing on that calendar is a cooling. In fact, people actually hypothesize that we've actually postponed the next ice age because of what we've done. And that's a good thing. Right. Because another ice age would be just as devastating as global warming. What we like is just a stable climate. And then the last cause people look to is the sun. They say, well, isn't it just, more energy from the sun? And that's an easy one because we can actually look at the sun's energy. And we see that since the 1900s, it was going very slowly up, just a little bit at a time. And then around about the 1970s, it started to go down. So, correlation doesn't imply causation, as the statisticians always like to tell us, but you have to at least have a correlation to look for causation. Yeah. And if the sun's energy is going down and your temperature is going up, well, that is not responsible. Yeah. So I go through these things first and then talk about how we burn coal and gas and oil. It produces carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide traps heat in the atmosphere. And we already have this perfect blanket around our planet that is just absolutely perfect for life. It keeps us at just the right temperature. But what we're doing is we are adding an extra blanket around the planet. And so just like you or I would at night if someone snuck in, like my grandma used to, and put an extra blanket over us, you wake up sweating. You're like, I don't need that extra blanket. It was just the perfect temperature. So that's what we're doing to our planet. We're putting that extra blanket around the planet that it was never designed to have, and that's why we're getting warmer. Yeah.
That's great. That's a fabulous overview. Thank you.
No problem.
One of the things that I've appreciated about your work and your relationship to your husband is it somewhat parallels, at least there's aspects of it that parallels my relationship to Connie, because I am a minister. I pastored 3 churches over the course of a decade. And Connie is a science writer, and she's written 4 acclaimed science books, and we've both been passionately concerned for ensuring a healthy future, and doing so with religious zeal, you could say, for quite some time. We've been living on the road now for 12 and a half years, traveling all over North America. We've spoken to about 2,000 groups. So this is what we do. And the one little difference is that sort of I'm out in the public more as the on the issue of science and religion and sustainability. She's more the geek. She works on audio and text and video editing and sort of a lot of the background stuff. But we both have this deep commitment for integrating science, religion, and inspiration and sustainability in ways that motivate people to go deeper into their own religious traditions if they're associated with a particular religious tradition, but also with secular people, help them see that there's an inspiration for them as well. But perhaps most importantly, to inspire people to work together across ethnic, religious, political, and philosophical differences in the service of a just and healthy future for all of us. And so I was wondering if you can share just anything you'd like to about the unique gifts and maybe challenges of you and your husband's sort of parallel, not identical, but parallel and intertwined ministry, and then your book that you co-authored.
Yeah. Well, as I was saying before, science is good up to a certain point. So science tells us there's a problem. Science tells us why we have a problem. Science can even explore the implications of different options. Like if we do X, here are the consequences. If we do Y, here are the outcomes of that choice. But science can't make the choices for us. And that's where our values come in. So that's why I feel like it is so important to connect this issue of climate change as well as the broader issue of sustainability, equitable sharing of resources, things like that, to our values. And for those of us who come from a faith tradition, that's where our values come from. And often we feel, or we've been told, I should say, that if we're Christians, we can't X. If we're Christians, we can't be an environmentalist, or we can't say that climate change is real, or we can't, it would be anti-Christian to put in one of those newfangled light bulbs or something like that, even if it saves us money. The reality is, though, is as Christians, we have everything we need already in our hearts to care about climate change, because caring about climate change is caring about people. And we know that we have all the love in our hearts that we've been given by God to love and care for other people. And so caring about climate change is just an extension of that love we have for our neighbors literally next door, as well as our neighbors around the world who are already feeling the impacts of this issue. My husband grew up in a very conservative church. He grew up going to a Southern Baptist school. So he had never met anybody who thought that climate change was real, who shared his Christian faith and his values. Now, I had grown up in Canada and in South America, my dad being a science educator. So I had actually never met a Christian who didn't think climate change was real. Because it isn't such a politicized issue up in Canada. And down in South America, where people are already kind of living on the edge, there's no debate over the reality of an issue like that. If your farm got washed away in a flood, you're not going to sit there and say that wasn't a real flood. Right. So we actually, we met at grad school, we got married, and it wasn't until probably about 6 months in that we realized that we were not on the same page on this issue. Because, I know that sounds ridiculous, but we just assumed that no reasonably intelligent person.
Exactly.
But here's the thing. I knew that my husband was a really smart person. He has a PhD in linguistics. He was, at age 27, he was a professor and an endowed chair at the University of Notre Dame. He was used to doing data. He was used to doing statistics and experiments. So he understood the scientific process by which we would both determine, his area of how people acquire language and my area of climate change. So we sat down together and we went at it. He brought all the arguments, I brought all the data, and I dug into a lot of information that I had never looked at before either, that I just kind of took for granted. So, it wasn't something we got into every day. Sure. And it was certainly a progressive process, but by having faith in each other and having a mutual respect, that the other person was not an idiot, that they had really good reasons for thinking what they did, and we both had that perspective. Sure. We eventually came to an agreement that this was a real issue, and he would tell you himself that what convinced him was when we went to the NASA website and he downloaded the global temperature data from NASA. And he put it into Excel and he plotted it on his own computer, and it was clearly going up. And he said, at that point, I have a choice. Either NASA, who put the man on the moon, is involved in this global conspiracy to make up data and create this imaginary issue, or else, just as we trusted NASA to put people on the moon, I'm going to trust NASA that they're right about this too. And for him, that was the Occam's razor moment, that the simplest answer is probably correct. Yeah. And since then, he's gone on to have his own very full career. He's written 8 books on practical theology now. He has a Sirius XM call-in show. He travels all around the country talking to people about issues related to faith and doctrine. And he has, a Facebook group of, over 10,000 people. And so it's really cool because what he does is focuses very much on theology, and what I do focuses very much on science. But every once in a while, like the other day, he'll put something up like about the Years of Living Dangerously series that we were both in, and then he'll get questions.
Yeah, sure.
Hey, I heard that Greenland was really warm, 1,000 years ago. So if Greenland was so warm, then how can you say that, humans are causing global warming today? Or isn't the world just going to end anyway? So if it's going to end, why are we going to all this trouble? Isn't it a good thing if the world is ending? And so I think that highlights how so many of the questions we have about this issue are not just scientific, but they're about the things that we believe to be true. Yeah. And so that's why it's so important to address people's questions and to address this issue, not just with scientific facts, but from a perspective of what's in our hearts and what matters to us the most.
Yeah, that's great. In fact, one of the things that I may do as a result of this conversation is reach out to your husband. One of the other podcast series that I've done for the last couple of years is called Evolving Faith, and I'm specifically there interviewing religious leaders and pastors and theologians who are sort of on the growing edge of their own faith tradition in terms of integrating science or, sort of ecology. I wrote a book called Thank God for Evolution, so clearly sort of evolutionary theology is something that's important to me. But so I think I'd really like to have him share, some of his own experience and how he does that, because while I occasionally get invited, even though I come, a little bit of my background, I grew up Roman Catholic, had a born-again experience in my teenage years, and was involved in a Pentecostal Assemblies of God context for about 5 years. I went to Evangelical College, which is affiliated with the Assemblies of God in Springfield, Missouri, and then graduated there with a double major in biblical studies and philosophy. Went to Eastern Baptist Theological Seminary and studied with Ron Sider. In fact, I was Ron Sider's assistant for a year. And then ended up pastoring three churches, three United Church of Christ congregations, one in Western Massachusetts, one in Southeast Ohio, and then one in Ann Arbor, Michigan. And throughout that time, my theology sort of kept expanding to include things that I hadn't included before. And I went from, frankly, being someone who, was just sort of a pretty standard Pentecostal evangelical. At the time, I actually referred to myself proudly as a fundamentalist. Now perhaps I'm still a fundamentalist, but the emphasis is on the fun rather than all the mental.
I like that.
And I consider myself a Christian naturalist or an evangelical naturalist, in that I interpret my faith somewhat differently than perhaps you and your husband do, but I find myself speaking to widely divergent audiences. I mean, I can do the exact same program with, in a progressive evangelical context, or a group of Catholics or Protestants or sort of New Thought or secular, groups of humanists and skeptics and free thinkers. And I don't have to change a single slide. In fact, I did a program a few years ago at the United Nations. And then Michael Shermer at Skeptic Magazine asked me to do that exact program. It was called Evolution and the Global Integrity Crisis. So I did that same program at Caltech for a group of 350 humanists and atheists. Exactly a week later, I gave that same program at Michael Beckwith's Agape Spiritual Life Center, which is sort of the New Age sort of mecca. And then a month later at a Catholic church, and 3 weeks after that at an evangelical church. Now, evangelicals, Catholics, atheists, and New Agers are radically different populations, but I didn't change a single slide. It was the same program. So it usually takes a courageous evangelical to invite me in, though. But because you have such credibility and such a heart, and you and your husband have such a passion and respect in that community, I wanted to ask a question. Because, many people are aware that perhaps the largest group of people that seem to be on the resistant side and so often susceptible to denialist propaganda are the conservative evangelicals and fundamentalists. And yet I have the belief, as I suspect you may share, that it's only a matter of time before evangelicals actually lead the way. I really believe that there can be a way of thinking about evangelical theology and even mythic understandings such as the second coming of Christ that motivate and inspire evangelicals to be really on the leading edge. And so I'm wondering, A, if that makes any sense to you, and B, when you speak in evangelical settings, or just maybe, let me back up, what changes or what shifts or growing within the evangelical message or the evangelical theological world do you think would need to be different, or perhaps are evolving or shifting? And do you see the possibility in the next 2, 3, 5, 10 years where evangelicals really could be on the growing edge, where they're actually leading culture on this topic?
Great question. Well, first of all, I completely agree with you that I think evangelicals should be on the leading edge. One of my favorite scholars whose work has really given me a new perspective on this issue is a French historian at Georgetown University, Jean-François Mouhot. He the slavery movement and climate change. Because in essence, we replaced our need for slave labor with using fossil fuels instead through machinery.
Yep.
What he has done, though, is he's gone farther and he's looked at the arguments people were using back then to preserve slavery. Mm-hmm. It's not so bad. We need it. It will destroy the economy if we give it up. Yep. The exact same arguments are being used today to retain climate change. Yes. But what really inspires me is the fact that back then, evangelicals were on the leading edge of standing up and saying, I don't care what it costs the economy, this is wrong, and we have to stop. Mm-hmm. And so that's why I have complete faith in our community that we can be leaders, because the same argument applies today. As Christians, our concern is not what it costs the economy. Our concern is that it is wrong and it has to stop. Mm-hmm. But then you'd say, well, why are we in this situation where when you poll Americans specifically, and you ask them whether they think climate change is real and whether it's being caused by humans, and then you parse that out by religious affiliation, evangelicals end up at the very bottom of the heap. Yeah. Here's the thing, though. When you control for political affiliation, much of that bias goes away. So I believe that what's been happening is increasingly over the past 20, 30, 40 decades, we have been confusing our faith with our politics. Partly due to a vacuum of leadership in the evangelical church. You know, Catholics have a pope, Anglicans, Episcopalians have archbishops. You know, the more hierarchical your church, the more mainline your church, the more structured the leadership. So leadership has time to investigate these issues and put together position papers and teaching resources and things like that. But evangelical churches are much more loosely organized. So we, by default, often rely on conservative media and conservative politics to give us our opinions on issues that we just don't have time to dig into ourselves. And we say, well, they share our values on X, Y, and Z, so why not share our values on climate change too? It's kind of a cognitive miser approach is what it's called in social science. We don't have the time to devote to investigate each issue ourselves. So I think that there has been this vacuum of consistent interdecadal leadership on social issues in the evangelical church. That vacuum has been filled by conservative media and politicians who do not have our best interests at heart and are not working from a base of Christian values, even though they may mouth them. And so the result is that we as a community have really been led astray by unreliable information, and we've really become a target for these disinformation campaigns because they are couched in conservative and sometimes even very religious sounding language.
Yeah. That's great. Well, I just deeply applaud both your work, but also your husband's and the work that you do together, because frankly, I don't think there's anything more important than engaging with the deep religious sensibilities of the American people, and recognizing that that's diverse, that that's a multifaceted thing. It's not a monolithic thing, but doing so in a way that is respectful and honoring of the tradition, and where people are at and where they're at, but doing so also in a way that inspires them to maybe you don't like the word evolve, but to evolve or to grow or to come to a new holding of the faith so that it is able to integrate. Let me back up. I see evidence as modern day divine revelation. So one of the things that I've been doing, and I just want to bounce this off you and see what you feel about this, because as I was saying, I just, anybody who's working with religious communities in a way that are helping them move beyond sort of places where perhaps their parents or their grandparents were, I think is doing holy work, doing God's work at this time. And one of the ways that I interviewed about 3.5 years ago, I interviewed 38 of the world's most prominent theologians and scientists and ministers who fully embrace an ecological evolutionary worldview. I mean, some of the top Catholics, the top Protestants, the top evangelicals, and so on. And I kept, in all 38 interviews, I was trying to find, is there something that we can say with confidence that we can speak with one voice about? I mean, we're all over the map, theologically, metaphysically, spiritually. I mean, we have different traditions and different language. But is there anything that we can say confidently that we share that is a core commons? And I sort of narrowed it down to three things. And then once I did that, I kept testing it with all the various people that I spoke with. And there seem to have been three sort of core things of agreement. One was that we all had deep time eyes. We all had an evolutionary understanding of reality that went both back millions and billions of years and also forward millions and billions of years. So we all had deep time eyes. We all had a global heart and a global commitment. That is, our commitment wasn't just to our own soul salvation or our religious group or even our nation state, but our commitment in a very real sense included the larger body of life of which we're all a part of, and the health of that. And then the third thing is that we all valued evidence as, in some very real sense, divine revelation, divine communication. Some felt comfortable, like I do, calling it modern day scripture. Others didn't feel quite comfortable with that language. But nonetheless, we all valued evidence, scientific, historic, and cross-cultural evidence, as, in some very real sense, divine communication or revelation. And those three things, deep time eyes, a global heart, and a valuing of evidence as divine communication, was something that all 38 of us agreed, no matter where we were at. And I find that really good news. And so I wanted to just ask you what you think of this idea of evidence as modern day divine revelation. Because I see you doing that, although you may not use that kind of language, it may be a bit of a stretch for some in evangelical circles. But how do you see, I guess this is the question, how do you see the interplay between ancient revelation that we find in the Bible, for example, or that has been embodied in some of the creeds within the tradition, and science and the findings of science? Because in my world, every scientific discovery is a revelation of God. I sometimes say facts are God's native tongue, that God is speaking through evidence. So I just wondered what you think about that, and what you see as the relationship between ancient scripture and sort of evidential scripture, or if you even feel comfortable using that kind of language.
For me, I wouldn't distinguish so much between the age of the revelation as I would between the method of delivery. And so I would reference the book of Romans, where Paul talks about how God is revealed through nature. And so, growing up in a Christian home with a father who is both a scientist as well as a teacher in our church, I very much grew up with the idea that God is revealed through nature to the extent that we can almost consider creation as a second book. That is a big part of, I think, why I do science. And it's interesting because I think it's something that's implicit in science that we as scientists don't often think about. We implicitly assume that the universe is understandable, that it's logical and rational, that there are rules that govern its behavior that can be understood and captured and used to predict situations that we have not yet. Where does this understandability come from? Where does this order and rationality come from? By studying the universe, by studying this planet, by studying the physical world, I do feel like I'm studying what God was thinking when he set it up. And when we study the earth and we see it telling us that it is getting warmer, that climate is changing, that what we are doing to the planet is causing enormous upheavals in both natural systems as well as human society, I believe that there is a truth to this because that is God's creation that is giving us that message. So I think that last point you cited is one that we definitely have in common across all areas of science.
Yeah.
And then issue number 2 that you said, this global perspective, is also one that I think we all share, because the reason why we care about this issue of climate change is because it is affecting people everywhere. I may have my air conditioning. I may have ample water where I live. I may feel able to get food up until the day that the apocalypse comes. But our neighbors are not so fortunate. And as Christians, that is our whole preoccupation, is to express the love of Christ to others. That's why we're here. Issue number 1, though, is an interesting one. That is regarding the age and the time frame that we look at. I found it very helpful to share with people how to agree that climate is changing and that humans are responsible, we don't need to agree that the planet or even the universe is any more than 300 years old. Because this whole problem began with the Industrial Revolution. In fact, the younger we think the Earth is, the stronger the evidence for humans being responsible. If you just look at the last 6,000 years, there are no major natural cycles over the last 6,000 years.
Yeah.
So you cannot argue natural cycles unless you're willing to go old Earth.
I love it. I love it.
So that's where I think we have even more points of agreement. And so on creation, the age of the universe, and evolution often comes up when I'm talking about things like climate change. And what I say is that these are issues that are really important to talk about and to discuss and to hopefully come to resolution on one day. I mean, I'm talking as a community, not as an individual. Obviously, as individuals, many of us already have. But the problem with climate change is we do not have the luxury of time.
Exactly.
If we wait another 5-10 years, as you yourself just said, there will be more people suffering. There will be more species going extinct. There will be more losses, more harm, more damages, more deaths with every year that we wait. And that is why we cannot afford to wait. And we have to identify as many points of agreement as we can in order to say, yes, it's a real issue. And yes, we need to move forward with it, even if we come from different parts of the political spectrum, even if we disagree on many other scientific issues, even if we disagree on issues of faith. We're all humans, we all live on this planet, and when it comes to the bottom line, that is the only value we need to agree this is important and we have to address it.
Yeah, I agree. Amen. Well, one of the things, you mentioned a word, and because it's such an important, well, I don't even want to say important, because it has been, at least for the last 150 years, and is currently for many people, many evangelicals, a core concept or a core understanding. This notion of the apocalypse. And for many people, they would look, I mean, let me back up. When I was a biblical literalist, fundamentalist, and I believed at that time in 1981, which is when I came to Christ in a really personal, committed way, I believed at the end of the world, I read the Bible straight through 3 times, and I believed that we would not see the year 2000. I believed that Jesus was coming back. And of course, the way I interpreted that at that time was that, a 6-foot, 180-pound man would come back magically on the clouds, and all us who had the right beliefs would be raptured up and this sort of thing. And I now hold a very different understanding of the second coming of Christ than I did then. I still find that core theological concept inspiring, but I now interpret it in a very different way. For me now, the second coming of Christ is not the unnatural return of a supernatural superhero to clean up the mess we've made, but the undeniable return of the awareness that God is right here, right now, present, incarnate in time, nature, and mystery. That is, incarnate in reality, as much as God was incarnate in Christ. And that we are called to be Christians, truly Christians, little Christ. We are called to be saviors of the future. We are called to embody that, not to passively wait for the second coming of Christ, but to actually participate in the return of the Lord, to use religious language, but this being a salvific influence. And I think the church can potentially play a hugely salvific role as it takes this on. Now, that's sort of my theology. But I'm wondering, you must have people within the evangelical community who say, this is good news. The fact that things are going to hell in a handbasket just shows that the end times are coming. And how do you deal with that? How do you respond to people for whom the worse things get, they interpret that through the lens of, oh, this is great because what we've been waiting for 2,000 years is finally going to happen?
I know exactly what you're talking about. I grew up in the 1970s, so my parents had a full bookshelf of Hal Lindsey and the original Left Behind novel. So we've grown up in a culture of the world is going to end any day. I mean, my parents even said to me, we never expected you to go to university. We thought the world would be over before that. And here I am. So that was very much the mindset, interestingly, back in the 70s, that we were not long for this world. But here's the thing. Whether you believe that we are waiting for a specific event, or whether you believe, as you do, that we are progressively moving towards a greater realization, I think that the Bible very clearly calls us to have the same attitude. Because in Thessalonians, there was a group of people who had that 1970s attitude, right? That Christ is returning any day now, so I'm just going to kick back. I'm just going to wait for that event to come, fold my hands, and we'll all be good. And Paul wrote to those people, and he wrote to them very strongly saying, get a job, care for others, take care of the poor and the people who need help. Support your family. Don't, sponge off of others. So we are given a very clear mandate that no matter what we think is going to happen in the future, we are called to actively live and love people in the present.
Yeah.
And so whatever we think is going to happen in 10, 100, or 1,000 years, today I think that our actions should look almost identical regardless of our opinion of the future. And that is to be caring for people who we see around us right here rather than looking backwards or forwards.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree, obviously, and I love the way that you just languaged that, because one of the things that I found challenging to hear when I learned about it was that I think at the last Gallup poll that I had seen, it was something like 41% of Americans, mostly evangelical Christians, believe that these are the end times anyway. So why bother concerning ourselves with what the world's going to be like 100 years or 1,000 years from now? And there were two things that I've experienced in the last 3 years that have made a humongous difference for me on this topic specifically. Mm-hmm. One of them is Brian Paisley, who does Canadian television. Had a Canadian series of I think it was 4 or 5 part series called Apocalypse When? ? And then within, actually prior to me watching that, because I met Brian and he gave me a copy of the DVDs. But I read John Michael Greer, who's one of my favorite writers. He writes the Archdruid Report, which is his blog. But he writes on peak oil and sustainability and this sort of thing. And he wrote a book called Apocalypse Not. The subtitle is Everything You Know About Nostradamus 2012 and the Rapture is Wrong. And both of them, John Michael Greer's book, Apocalypse Not, and Brian Paisley's video series called Apocalypse When, it's interesting. Independently, neither one of them had ever heard of each other. But both of them chronicled the 3,200-year history of end times thinking and some of the tragedies and the suffering that has resulted from both secular and religious people believing that this is the end of the world within the next couple decades. And, so I'm always recommending those two things for people who just think that we shouldn't be responsible for the future because X, Y, or Z.
Well, and actually to that, I would add something very important.
Okay.
This May, I was a lead author on the U.S. National Climate Assessment, which basically assesses the state of climate and says, here's what's happening and here's why we care. Their number one key message of that assessment, which is put together by over 100 authors from all around the country and exhaustively peer-reviewed, all science, no theology. The number one conclusion was that climate change is no longer a distant issue. It is here now. Yeah. It is not about tomorrow, next year, or 100 years from now. It's not about the next generation anymore. Yeah. We are feeling the impacts today. We can put a dollar sign on the amount it's costing us. People are suffering today from it. We are losing an average of $5 billion a year in global food production because of climate change since the 1980s every year. So the whole issue of, is it this future issue? No, it's not. It's here today. So again, regardless of what we think is going to happen in the future, it doesn't matter because climate change is now.
Yeah. Beautifully said. Thank you. Well, I know you have a young son, and I have a granddaughter that's almost 4 years old. And so this whole theme that the future is calling us to greatness, I actually keep a picture of my granddaughter often by my computer that reminds, she is the embodiment of the future calling me to greatness. And so one of the questions that I've been asking my guests in this series is, what wakes you up on a day-by-day, week-by-week basis? What inspires you to be in action in the face of some really scary stuff?
Me up is usually being hit over the head by a pillow pet. And what inspires me to get up is I'm late for school breakfast. But leaving that aside, there's no doubt about it. I mean, studying climate change is not exactly an encouraging thing. I mean, there are definitely times when I'm very depressed and discouraged. Some of the biggest challenges come through the opposition I experience. When you open up your emails in the morning and there's just email after email saying you're an idiot, get a job at McDonald's, go die. You're just like, why am I doing what I'm doing? Yeah. When you read books like The Climate Cover-Up by Jim Hogan, who's a PR specialist who just details in, chapter after chapter, all the sophisticated ways that are being used today to deceive us on this issue. on all of the advertising techniques and PR techniques honed over decades that are
Yes.
now being applied to the issue of climate science to tell people it's not real
Yeah.
and there's nothing we need to do about it. These are the things that discourage me. But what encourages me is when I talk to people, when I go out and I talk to local farmers in a small, tiny conservative town where everybody goes to church and nobody thinks climate change is real, but they all show up when I speak at the local civic center. And afterwards, they say things like, well, I've always been told this wasn't a real issue, but here's somebody who shares my faith,
Yes.
who explained to me why it matters to me here today, why it's affecting things like the drought that we have here that's destroyed my crops. I agree this is an important issue, and I want to know what to do about it now.
Yeah.
I mean, that's what encourages me. When I go into work with a city, and the city says, the city of Dallas, for example, says, well, we have actually just upped the LEED certification on our buildings, not just because of wanting to be green, but it's because it saves us money.
Yeah. Right.
People are moving into the urban core because we're being so much more greener and friendlier, and we love it too. I mean, I see all these things happening around us, and no matter how discouraging it gets at the national level and the international level, here, bottom line, even in Texas, people care about this issue, people are moving forward about this issue, and we're seeing change. We smashed some records in the spring where we got over a third of our electricity from wind here in Texas in the spring.
Wow.
I mean, when you see things like that happening, like I said, in Texas,
Yeah.
what else can we see anywhere else in the world?
Yeah. Yeah.
So I envision this amazing future, where we shingle our houses and solar panels.
Yes.
And
Exactly.
our kids' backpacks charge their iPad as they walk to school. And all of our energy comes from clean sources that God gave us that don't pollute our air or our water or use up the resources that we need. And everybody has enough food to eat, and everybody's healthier because we have less contaminants in our environment from the dirty energy we're using. I see a world that is much better to live in than the world today. And I think that by tackling climate change, we're actually moving closer to that world.
Yeah. Yeah. Amen. Amen. Well, there's a question my wife, just winding down now, there's a question that my wife has asked me specifically to ask my guests.
Okay.
And it's off the wall. I purposely don't tell you about it ahead of time, but it's been really fun to hear the responses. And that is that if you could have dinner or, a glass of wine or, a cup of coffee or whatever, but if you could have sort of a one-on-one conversation or perhaps a dinner party with 3 people from any time in human history, so either a dinner party where there's all 4 of you together having a conversation over a meal, or just one-on-one over, a meal or a glass of wine or a cup of coffee, whatever, with any 3 people in human history, who would those 3 people be and why would you choose them?
Oh man, that's an awesome question. And you want me to answer off the top of my head?
Exactly.
Just out of curiosity, has anybody ever had a prepared answer to this question?
Nope.
Okay. Because there was that whole, dinner with a stranger book. But
Oh, right. Yeah. No. This I purposely have not let anybody know ahead of time, and the responses have been really interesting all over the place. And the most common one is, "Oh gosh, I'd have to give that more thought."
I know, exactly. All right, I'm gonna try to come up with some ideas off the top of my head. Number 1 is I would pick William Wilberforce.
Yes.
Because I would just want to hear about his life experience, how he got through the things that he did and how he achieved what he did, because he was a Christian who was at the forefront of getting rid of slavery. And I just really admire the fact that he combined his faith and his Christian values with social action in a situation that, as we discussed, is very similar to today. The opposition he got is incredibly similar to the opposition that we are getting today on climate change. So I would just want to sit down with him and say, how did you do it? Then, as a Christian, obviously, I don't know how you could not want to sit down with Jesus and just say, what's the deal? Why is this happening? Where do we go from here? Any suggestions?
Exactly.
And also just as encouragement to just say, this is why we're doing what we're doing. Life is not easy. Doing what I'm doing is not easy. Being an astrophysicist would have been honestly a lot more fun most days and a lot easier. So remind me again, why are we here? Why do we have this mandate to love other people? Why is this so important? And from the perspective of astrophysics, how exactly did you begin the universe again? I would like to know that one.
Okay.
And then, let's see, who else? I think it would be really inspiring to sit down with, and there's many of them, any number of women who have managed to kind of overcome all the barriers that often gender, socioeconomic status, race, things like that throw in our way. Because there's a unique component to being a woman who is trying to lead on issues. There are some issues or some ways, I should say, in which men really have the advantage. One of the ways is just as a woman, it's hard if you're not moderated in your language and your approach. People are quick to label you with many 5-letter words and 4-letter words if you don't conform to stereotypes. And so I would like to sit down with somebody who really bucked the stereotypes in a big way during their life, but did so very gracefully and with integrity and being true to who they were and to their faith at the same time.
Yeah, beautiful.
So.
That was wonderful. Well, Katharine, this has been such a wonderful conversation. And again, as I said before, I just deeply honor the work that you're doing and the work that your husband's doing. In fact, please mention to him that I'll be sending him an email and inviting him to have a conversation for my separate Evolving Faith podcast series.
Absolutely.
But any last things you'd like to say on this theme of the past is rooting for us and the future is calling us to greatness?
I think that's definitely the case. I think that it's a mistake to castigate ourselves for what we've done, because you could say, well, the whole reason we're in this situation now is because of the Industrial Revolution. So we need to repent from the evils that led us to this terrible sin that we've committed. When we dug that coal and gas and oil out of the ground and burned it to power our factories, to improve our welfare, to develop new medications, new technologies, new ways of doing things that have led to better lives for many people around the world, we didn't know it would lead to climate change, and there are many good things that we achieved through doing that.
Exactly.
So I would say that looking backwards and beating ourselves up over the things that we have done is not the way to move forward. The way to move forward is to say, thank you for all the benefits that the Industrial Revolution brought us. Thank you for the fact that we're at a place where we have the technology that we do today. And let us use that as a source of encouragement to say how different the future can be from what we've experienced in the past.
Amen. Amen. Well, God bless you, Katharine, and your work, and thank you for taking the time to have this conversation. And where people that want to go more deeply into your work specifically, where would be the best place to send them?
Oh, great question. I have channels on YouTube and Vimeo where people can catch up on other videos. There's a great series called The Years of Living Dangerously that aired on Showtime this year that is coming out. I think it's coming out on iTunes on September 7th.
Yep.
So that's a great place to see some of the work I do, but also some of the amazing work that other people do around the world looking at how climate change is affecting us in a very real way. I would also encourage people to take a look at the U.S. National Climate Assessment. I know that kind of sounds a little intimidating. It's kind of long words, but it isn't a scientific report written for scientists. It's a scientific report written just for people.
Yeah.
They have a great website, and what it does is it tells us if I live in California, if I live in Iowa, if I live in Atlanta, why should I care about climate change? Mm-hmm. The assessment answers that, and it has a great frequently asked questions section, which I wrote a lot of, that just lays out in very clear terms, how do we know climate change is real? Why do we think it's humans that are causing it? What do we expect in the future? And what can we do about this problem?
Yeah.
I would also encourage people to check out the book I wrote with my husband, A Climate for Change, Global Warming Facts for Faith-Based Decisions. Yep. And lastly, the number one question I get these days is, what can I do? Because we want to do something about this problem. I would say two things. I would say, number one, go online and find a carbon calculator. It's a calculator where you enter where you live, how many people live in your house, how far you drive to work, how far you travel every year. I'm sure you've used one yourself. And what it does is it helps us figure out how much carbon we're producing now. And then if it's a good carbon calculator, it's going to give a whole bunch of different suggestions of ways that we can reduce it. I kind of look at it like losing weight. If you're going to lose weight, the first thing to do is to weigh yourself, right? Because if we don't weigh ourselves, how do we know what goal we're going to set and if we even got there?
Exactly.
So in the same way, let's weigh our carbon footprint and then look at different ways. For one person, it might be eating less meat. For another person, it might be carpooling. Another person might be changing the light bulbs, because actually changing light bulbs is very effective. If everybody in the US changed one light bulb, it'd be like taking 1 million cars off the road. So there's no one magic, every size fits all, but there is a carbon calculator that tells us what to do. So that's number one. Number two, I would say, is look up an organization, which you know about, called Citizens Climate Lobby, and join your local chapter. Citizens Climate Lobby is the best organization I have found, and that's why I agreed to serve on their board, that empowers the average citizen to talk to our elected officials. It's not just in the US, it's in Canada, and it's in all kinds of countries around the world. Yeah. Because so many countries are blessed with a democracy with elected officials. So join them and learn how you can make a difference, how you can talk to somebody, how you can write an op-ed, how you can even just sign a letter saying, I care about this issue and I wish you would too.
Yeah, that's great. I'm so glad that you mentioned both the carbon footprint and how you can sort of calculate that and steps you can take, but also especially Citizens Climate Lobby, because at some point in the next 2 to 8 years, we will in fact put a fair price on carbon pollution, and we will marshal the power of the market to help us move in the right direction. And what I often tell my evening audiences when I do programs, I have a slide on Citizens Climate Lobby, and I say, you want to be able to look some young person in the eyes 2, 3, 4, 5 years from now and say, I helped make that happen. It'll be one of the prideful, one of the best moments of your life in terms of joy. So.
Yes.
Well, Katharine, thank you so much, and just blessings on your continued work. This has been really wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you for what you're doing too.
Thanks. Okay. Bye-bye.